Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Paul, and Paul, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Darren, and thanks everybody for tuning in today. So we're gonna talk about lawns and lawns in the fall. Let me go ahead and bring up just a few slides to talk about for a few minutes before we get to some questions. And I already see some questions in the chat. I know at least one of those questions we're going to answer in these slides, so that's always nice. All right, so what do we do about lawns in the fall? The good news is that fall is the absolute best time of the year to work on your lawns. It's, there's cooler temperatures, there's more consistent soil moisture, there's less weed pressure from annual weeds. So, crabgrass, there's really no new crabgrass germinating in the fall. So for those reasons, fall is really a great time of year to work on the lawn. Unfortunately, by fall, most people are sick of their lawn. And so it kind of turns into the time of year that the least people are doing the least amount of work, but it's actually the best time of year to go ahead and work on the lawn. So let's just touch on a couple of the major topics related to fall lawn care. And the first one we'll touch on is turf grass fertilization. All right, so we mostly focus on nitrogen when we talk about turf grass fertilization. The other two numbers, the numbers on the fertilizer label. The first one is nitrogen, the middle one is phosphorus, and the third number is potassium. Turf grass lawns are very rarely deficient in phosphorus and potassium, so we typically rely mostly on nitrogen applications to drive turf grass growth. And fall is a great time of year to fertilize. Typically, we've kind of changed recommendations a little bit on timing of fertilizer, and this is due to some of the research of my colleague here at Wisconsin, Doug Soldat. We used to have sort of the 4 summer and fall holidays for fertilizing your lawn, right? So you'd start with Memorial Day, July 4th, Labor Day, and then Halloween would be the final one. We've kind of backed away from recommending fertilization at that Halloween time because most of the fertilizer is not really taken up by the turf because it's not growing at that time of year. So now we kind of emphasize that Labor Day application. So anywhere between 2 to 3 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet per year. And really that Labor Day application is the most important one of the year. So if you're one of those people, or if you talk with other people and they're only going to fertilize once a year, which for most lawns is probably sufficient, depending on the environment there and the turf grass species there, that Labor Day application is really the most important one. It's going to allow for root growth because the soil temperatures are much warmer than they are in the spring, and the air temperatures aren't quite as hot as they are during the summer. So the turf is under less stress than that midsummer application. So fertilization in between, typically a half a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet up to 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Right around Labor Day is the most important fertilization application of the year. You can still put out that one later in the fall, but most of it is really not doing a whole lot of benefit for the turf. It's really just kind of held in the soil and then will be taken up the following spring rather than taken up that fall. So that's why we've kind of gone away from recommending that Halloween application and more focused on that Labor Day application for really driving strong growth, root growth during the fall. All right, on to mowing, right? So, again, people are starting to tune out their lawns, and, my own lawn is pretty long right now as we start to prepare for the semester here at Madison, but it's obviously we want to keep up with our mowing throughout the fall. One recommendation that I've heard a lot in the past is that you want to mow your last mowing really short. Your last mowing of the year, mow really short so that you don't have really long turf that lays over and results in snow mold. And I don't recommend that. I've never seen any evidence that really prevents any sort of significant snow mold development. And it can actually harm the turf, because what you're doing is you're sort of shocking the turf when you remove all that green leaf tissue. So you might actually remove some of the energy the plant has created to survive the winter. So you can actually increase the damage that might occur to the lawn over the winter. The other thing that you do when you mow really short for that last mowing is that you open up the canopy. And anytime you open up the canopy and see more soil underneath, you're gonna be more susceptible to weed encroachment. Now, not this fall, you wouldn't. The weed encroachment would occur the following spring, right? So if you mow really short, you're gonna have more exposure to the soil. That sunlight next spring will be able to hit that soil easier, and that's going to lead to to increased germination of various weed seeds. So that's why we do not recommend mowing short for that final application of the year. At the same time, though, you don't want to just let it go, right? So if it does get really long, 4, 5, 6 inches, that turf can then lay over, trap moisture, trap heat, and lead to increases in snow mold development. So my recommendation is just whatever you mowed it at all year, just mow it that way all through the end of the season. So typically for most turf grass species in Wisconsin, in most situations, anywhere between 2.5 and 3.5 inches, and just do that all year long. All right, weed control. Depending on the weeds, fall is the best time of year to control perennial weeds. Completely pointless time of year to control annual weeds, right? So something like crabgrass, an aggressive annual weed. Most annual weeds in Wisconsin die at the first hard frost. So at this point in time, it's pretty pointless to go out there and control something like crabgrass. But perennial weeds, especially difficult to control perennial weeds, fall is the best time of the year to control those weeds. And so when we talk about difficult to control weeds, we talk about ones that don't typically respond very well to various herbicides during the spring and the summer. So creeping Charlie is typically the best example of this, or the number one sort of weed question that we get. But other ones like clover and plantain and violet, these are weeds that don't typically respond readily to herbicide applications. But if you make those applications in the fall, the control increases pretty significantly. And the reason for that is most herbicides translocate most weeds translocate herbicides upwards in the weed. So they'll absorb the product and they'll translocate them, but only upwards. They don't move them down very effectively. But if you apply the herbicides in the fall, the weeds are getting ready for winter. So what they're doing is they're recognizing that the day length is getting shorter, the temperatures are getting colder, and they're going to start to move their sugars and the energy that they're producing with their leaves down to their underground storage structures, their tubers and their rhizomes and that sort of thing. And if you apply an herbicide at that point in time, it will actually drag the herbicide down with the other materials that they're transporting and provide a more complete control of those weeds. So if anybody is struggling with creeping Charlie control or clover control, applying the herbicide, the same herbicide that they would apply earlier in the year, typically the 3-way mixture of 2,4-D dicamba and MCPP, just applying that in the fall after the first hard frost of the year, really seems to increase the level of control of those particular weeds. So again, great time of year to control perennial weeds, terrible, pointless waste of money for annual weeds. So know the type of weed that you're trying to control. And then just general work, right? Lawns can be beat up during the summer. For a lot of the state this year, it was a pretty dry summer. So we saw some damage from various drought stresses. We didn't see much in the way of diseases this year. We didn't see a whole lot in the way of insects this year, especially grub damage. But there was quite a bit of drought damage out there. So fall is the best time of the year to do any sort of seeding or repair work. And when we talk about fall, we're talking about typically the first half of September. So this is a well-timed webinar. Get out there and do it in the next couple of weeks. Really, if you're in the southern half of the state, you probably have until early October to do a lot of this work. If you're in the northern part of the state, you'd want to have it done by certainly the middle or latter portion of September. Really, the goal is to get the plants to come up and germinate and mature for a solid 4 to 6 weeks before the snow comes. And given that some bluegrasses take 2 to 3 weeks to just to germinate, those plants can really take some time to mature. So when we're talking about any sort of seeding work, the first part of September is ideal because, again, we have those consistent soil temperatures. Typically, we're getting more regular rainfalls, and we don't have the really hot conditions that can be really stressful for new seedlings. It's also the best time of the year if you're going to do any sort of aerification. So if you have compacted soils or a really thick thatch layer, and you're going to come in and aerify, the first part of September is typically the best time of year to do that for the same reasons I just mentioned, right? The soil temperatures are warm, there's moisture, the plants are typically a little less stressed, and also there's fewer weeds that germinate in the fall. We talked about that earlier with annual weeds. When you're aerifying, you're kind of poking all these holes in the soil, and you're making these nice little beds for weeds to germinate. And so in the spring, aerification can lead to increased weed encroachment, depending on the situation. But in the fall, we typically see that much less because there's just fewer weeds that germinate in the fall. And, we always talk about with various people, if they want to switch to a different turfgrass species, or if they want to switch to a more sustainable turfgrass species that's more shade tolerant and more drought tolerant, requires less fertility. Fall is a great time of year to convert or transition to that. Really the best time of year to do any sort of significant sort of repair or seeding work. All right, so that's all the information that I have. I also want to mention that we have a turfgrass diagnostic lab. So this is separate from the lab that Dr. Huddleston runs, the Plant Disease Diagnostic Clinic. Basically, Dr. Huddleston's lab does all plants except turf, right? So turf is just kind of a unique, odd animal out there. And so we have a separate turfgrass diagnostic lab. And this is not just for diseases, it can be for any sort of ailment to your turf. And here's all the information. Website is on there. Kurt Hockmeyer is the manager of that diagnostic lab. It's housed within my lab, but Kurt Hockmeyer runs the diagnostic lab for turf on a day-to-day basis. So a great resource if you're struggling with any sort of turf issues. We'll do weed ID, grass ID, insect ID as well. So a good resource. And here's my information. If I don't get to your question today, or if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to go ahead and send me an email, give me a call, and I'd be happy to chat through your question with you. All right, with that, let's go to questions.
All right, Paul, why don't we start with what do you do about areas that are compacted clay soil and trying to grow lawn grass?
Yeah.
That would be aeration.
Yeah, going with an aerator. And typically you'll want to get the ones that are the actual sort of machines that you would walk in front of, or that a tractor would drag. The sort of the big drums that just have the spikes on them, those don't do any significant sort of traffic or compaction reduction. So normally we would recommend that you rent or hire a service to come in with the machine that's going to have the hollow tine that's going to pull out the chunks of soil. Clay soils are hard because they compact relatively easily. So, one thing we would often recommend in that situation is after the aerification is done to add in some sort of compost or organic matter, which will increase the pore spaces in that soil.
Okay, we got two questions that are kind of related to each other, and it's the timing between applying herbicide and fertilization before doing reseeding.
Yeah, so that's going to be dependent on the herbicide. So certain herbicides have both post-emergent and pre-emergent activities. So like the classic crabgrass pre-emergent, pendimethalin, is sort of the orange product that you would buy as sort of the first step in the Scott's 4-step program from the hardware store. That one is a pure pre-emergent, and it will prevent germination of all seeds, weeds and turfgrass, for multiple months. So if you apply that in April, you probably wouldn't be able to seed until the very end of summer at the earliest, and maybe into the fall. But if you did apply in April, you would be able to seed now. But other products have pre-emergent activity as well. So a lot of times it's less than pendimethalin, might be 4 to 6 weeks, something like that. Something like glyphosate, though, if you spray Roundup, that one has very little pre-emergent activity. You can typically seed into glyphosate. I would probably give it a week, but you can realistically seed into an area that you've treated with glyphosate after about 3 or 4 days. There's very little pre-emergent activity with that product.
And the same thing with the fertilization of the timing after fertilization for reseeding or before.
Well, if it's a straight fertilizer and there's no herbicide in there, there's no issues with having to wait. You can, oftentimes we recommend putting down a starter fertilizer, which just has more phosphorus. That's the only thing that makes a starter fertilizer different than a normal fertilizer is more phosphorus. But normally we recommend putting a starter fertilizer down with a seeding project. So there's no issues with fertilization and waiting to seed, as long as there's no herbicide mixed in with it.
I got a couple of questions about clover. One is, if you have white clover in your lawn, does it produce enough nitrogen to feed the grass with no additional fertilizer? And could you explain your reason to consider clover a weed?
Yeah, that's a great question, and of course, a weed is a philosophical definition, right? So it's just a plant that is out of place. So as far as clover and providing enough nitrogen for the lawn, if it is interspersed throughout the lawn, it will provide enough nitrogen. And where clover becomes undesirable to certain people is when it's in clumps scattered around. And so where the clumps are, and we've seen this before, if you have a clump of clover, typically the grass is greener around that clump of clover than grass not surrounding that clover. So if you just had clumps of clover here and there, that wouldn't provide enough nitrogen for the entire lawn. It would provide enough nitrogen for the turf surrounding the clover, but not for the other areas. So there's actually, not to get too far off topic here, but if you looked at lawn seed mixes pre-World War II, they all contained clover in there because there was no synthetic fertilizer industry at that point in time. So the clover was in there to fertilize the lawn. And so after synthetic fertilizers became widespread and commonplace, then clovers were sort of taken out. And they're starting to come back a little bit. You can get a turf grass micro clover mix, and the clover leaves are smaller than sort of a traditional white clover, and so they blend into the yard much more effectively, and they still produce nitrogen. So if you have that kind of micro clover turf grass seed mix, it appears very uniform, which is the problem that most people have with traditional clover, is that it's non-uniform, and it provides the nitrogen. So we have some test plots here at our research facility, and they look great. One other concern with that clover then is that micro clover is then you couldn't control other weeds that would come in. So if you want the clover, but you don't want, say, creeping Charlie or dandelions, if you would go and spray an herbicide to kill those other ones, you would kill the micro clover as well. So that would be one concern.
All right. So someone has got a moss issue in their lawn, and they're wanting to use a biocide to kill the moss. They're wondering if, can they reseed safely into those products? But maybe a bigger issue than just removing the moss.
Yeah, moss is almost universally in response to shade, too much shade for the turf that's there. So moss does not kill turf. Moss doesn't produce anything that will kill any turf. Moss just is opportunistic when turf thins out due to shade. So if you go ahead, you can apply some of those products you buy from the store, and it'll brown out and dry out the moss. But the moss is just going to come back unless you change the environment. So either increase the sunlight, increase the air movement, or put a different plant in there. Sometimes that might be a more shade tolerant turf, or depending on the degree of shade, you might have to go with a ground cover or something like that. But there's no pre-emergent activity with moss removal products. It's just normally the moss comes back pretty quickly because it's an environment that's not conducive for the turf.
All right. Question on large mushrooms in the lawn and what you can do about them.
Pick them. Yeah, there's nothing you're going to go in and do. The good news is most mushrooms in yards are not toxic to pets or people. Every once in a while, there's one that comes up that can be toxic, but most mushrooms in the yard are not toxic. So it's more of an aesthetic issue. Normally, the mushrooms come up from, if there is a tree that was cut down or something, and the root system is decaying over time, and we see the mushrooms come up from there. But yeah, there's no product to apply or anything like that. Just kind of pick them as they come up.
All right. So your thoughts on mulching leaves versus raking and bagging?
Great question. Mulch away. One caveat there is you'll want to mulch and integrate the leaves so that they are in the turf canopy. They're not on top of it. So we actually have a study that we're going to implement this upcoming fall that's looking at thickness of the mulch leaves and kind of what impacts it has on the turf. Past research has shown that if you mulch those leaves in, it adds nitrogen, it adds organic matter to the soil, provides a healthier soil, which results in a healthier turf. The problem is if we smother the turf, right? So if you're going to mulch the leaves in, that's a great idea. Keeps the leaves off of the curb, which really adds a lot of phosphorus to the watershed. There was a study sponsored by the Clean Lakes Alliance here in Madison that showed that about 80% of the phosphorus entering from the urban part, the non-agricultural part of the lakes here in Madison was from tree leaves placed in the street in the fall. And so that can be keeping those leaves off the curb and mulching them into the lawn is a great way to keep that phosphorus from running into the watershed. But just make sure that you see turf grass leaves poking up through the tree leaves. If you mulch your leaves and you can't see any grass leaves coming through there, you're creating an environment that's going to be conducive for smothering the turf and killing it over the winter. But I love mulching leaves. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Paul. I'm going to circle back to some aeration and seeding questions because we had quite a few questions about that. So I know you mentioned about aerating. Is it best to just hire somebody to do it, or can people do it on their own?
Yeah, I mean, most hardware stores or co-ops will have aerators that you can rent. So aeration is one of the more expensive services that most lawn care companies provide. So again, it's just getting to your comfort level and what you want to spend. But most hardware stores or most places that rent equipment will have aerators that you can rent, and those are perfectly fine. Again, I would go with the ones that have the hollow tines that actually kind of a walk in front of machine and not just a drum that you pull behind a tractor. Those typically don't provide much benefit. So.
And can you comment on the frequency of how often someone should aerate their lawn?
Yeah, I mean, you don't need to aerate every year. It's kind of, you would aerate for I guess I'll say three reasons. One reason is for soil compaction, right? So if your soil is really, really hard, so if you have a screwdriver and you try and poke it in that yard and you have to work really hard to get the screwdriver in there, that's a good indication that you have some compacted soil, and it might be good to aerate and get some more oxygen flow in there. The other reason is for really thick thatch layers. So thatch is sort of a layer of old stems that can accumulate over time in a turf grass lawn. Not all lawns, but some lawns, especially ones that might be over fertilized or formally sodded, can have some thick thatch layers. And the problem with a thatch layer is, one, they can harbor a lot of fungi, so they can harbor a lot of fungal diseases. And the other problem with thick thatch layers is that they can also be a little squishy. But more problematic is that they can trap a lot of roots up in the thatch layer, so you don't get a lot of deep rooting, and then your turf is not really that resistant to drought. You have to it dries out very, very easily. So those are some reasons why we want to reduce a thatch layer. And the third one is just kind of improve an overseeding or a reseeding operation, right? So if you kind of want to open up some more soil to get some new seed in, aeration is one way to do that.
So someone would aerate first and then go ahead and reseed after that.
Yep.
One more seeding question there was about, what about seeding in March? If you're throwing seed on top of the snow, would that work?
Well, it could work. You're going to have less success, and because the reason is it's going to germinate slower because the temperatures are colder, especially the soil temperatures, right? It takes a long time in spring for our soil temps to really warm up to a point where the grass is germinating quickly. You can do it. You're also going to be kind of at the mercy of sort of where the snow melts and may take the seed. So you don't have a lot of control, but sod farmers, actually, they seed into snow. It's not uncommon for sod farmers when they're seeding a new crop of turf, they can put that seed down in the snow. But for most homeowners, I wouldn't recommend putting the seed down in the snow. You just don't have a lot of control over where it's going.
Somebody asked if you have to roll a lawn after reseeding.
No, no.
Okay.
I mean, you'll want to get some sort of seed to soil contact. So if you put the seed down, you kind of just throw it on the top. You'll want to do something to get some soil come into close contact. Normally, what we do in our research when we're seeding is we'll just go over it with a plastic rake. You just kind of walk over it once with a plastic rake. That kind of integrates the seed into the top sort of quarter inch of soil a little bit, and then you'll want to put some sort of mulch, straw or paper mulch, or the green tinted paper mulch or something like that. You'll want to put some sort of mulch on top of that to retain moisture so that it germinates and stays wet.
Okay. Kind of going off the lawn rolling, I have a bumpy lawn question. They had it rolled by service with a 2-wheel machine, but it didn't solve the problem. They're asking about spreading sand. I guess they've been doing some YouTube searching and a lot of the videos are not from this area. So really bumpy lawn, what would be your recommendation there?
Yeah, bumpy lawns are hard. There's no quick fix on that. Putting a roller over it, as the person mentioned, typically is a very short term, if anything, benefit, because whatever is going on in the lawn just kind of tends to come right back. What we normally recommend, and it's a longer term fix, is to aerify relatively aggressively and then go in with organic matter. So an organic matter compost, like a compost. Sand is not normally a great thing to throw in the lawns unless you already have a sandy lawn. So if you're kind of in the central part of the state, in the central sands, and you have a pretty sandy soil, then that would be fine, is to throw in some sand. But normally we would recommend sort of using a compost to increase organic matter and pore space into those soils, because normally a bumpy lawn is a product of some pretty heavy clay in there. And so if you can sort of open things up a little bit, put down some compost, that over time can sort of help smooth things out. But that's one that unfortunately I don't have a great one for. It's a longer term fix.
Okay. One more, and then I'm going to kick it back over to Darren. I had some questions. I'm just going to group them together. There's quite a few questions about choosing the type of turf grass to grow. So can you comment just on, how to select a seed mix or turf grass species for their lawn or different areas in their lawn?
Yeah. So the one thing I'll lead with is there's no perfect turf grass for every situation. There's no ideal silver bullet grass that's going to be great. For those that have high expectations, high traffic, and a lot of sun, we would just normally recommend a Kentucky bluegrass. For those that have some shade or want more of a low input turf, you can go with either fine fescues or tall fescue. So fine fescues are a very slow growing turf as well. Sometimes, if you hear of like no-mow turfs or low-mow turfs that you only have to mow a couple times a year, those are just fine fescues. They're not any sort of new fancy turf. They're just fine fescues that grow really slowly. And so fine fescues do well in shade and low fertility environments, but they also don't do well in thick soils. So that's kind of the Achilles heel of fine fescues. If you have a really thick clay soil, they won't do well in that situation. Tall fescue is very drought tolerant, also does not require a lot of fertility. It does grow faster than like fine fescue, so you're going to have to mow a tall fescue about as often as you would a Kentucky bluegrass, but it's really quite drought tolerant. It's more shade tolerant than Kentucky bluegrass. And we've really recommended it a lot more as sort of a more sustainable turf grass species for our environment. It doesn't do well if it's trapped under ice for a really long period of time. Snow, it's fine. But if you have like a drainage swale or something that really is under ice a lot in the spring as snow is melting off, that's not a great environment for that particular turf. So yeah, when we talk about more sustainable turfs, shade tolerant, drought tolerant, low fertility, we're normally talking about fine fescues or tall fescue.
Okay, let's answer a couple of pest and disease questions here before our time is up. Somebody was diagnosed with necrotic ring spot, and they cannot get anything to grow in those spots even 5 years later. Any suggestions?
Yeah, the issue then isn't the necrotic ring spot. The necrotic ring spot is a root infecting fungus of mostly Kentucky bluegrass. Some other species are kind of susceptible as well, but it wouldn't prevent the germination of new turf grasses. So there's something else is probably going on there. Normally, if you have necrotic ring spot, we recommend sort of aerating that area, roughing it up, and putting in either a tall fescue or a fine fescue or maybe even a perennial ryegrass, because the most susceptible turfgrass species to necrotic ring spot is Kentucky bluegrass.
Okay, and what's the best way to recover from red thread fungus?
Yeah, fertilize and wait it out. It's red thread is a disease of sort of moderate temperatures but high moisture. So when we have sort of cloudy, humid conditions for several days, we'll get some red thread that'll come up mostly on perennial ryegrass and fine fescues. Bluegrass doesn't normally get red thread, neither does tall fescue, but it doesn't kill the turf. Normally when things dry out and either heat up or cool down, be outside of that window of optimal temperatures, it recovers on its own.
Okay, well, we are at 12:30, so thank you so much, Paul. Thank you, everybody who attended. Please take a few moments to respond to our survey so that we can get better information to create more webinars for everyone. Thanks and have a good week.